More Tales Told by a Dubliner by Turlough Conmee. Story number 7. The Alien Townhouse. The wife lives in a townhouse complex in Laufen. There are 8 semi-detached houses in 4 standalone buildings, and they are grouped around a central open space. The houses themselves are a narrow 3-storey affair, but they have plenty of rooms in them, and I regularly spend time there with the wife, travelling across from the Grisons at the other end of Switzerland. Early on in our relationship, she banished me to her room at the top of the house due to snoring, though actually it's her that snores the most. Over the years, I've got used to being up there on my own, in a sort of attic bedroom just under the roof. Each of the houses has a large skylight in the sloping roof, front and back, and you can watch the progress of the moon through the night sky as you lie in bed. Often I have been pleasantly awakened during the night by a full moon looking in through the skylight, making it as bright as day. There's also a window let into the side wall. This overlooks the open space where a block party is held during the summer. It also overlooks a few of the other houses and gardens. I like to look out there at night before I go to bed, or if I wake up in the small hours of the morning, which I often do. There's a kind of subdued low-level lighting on the paths between the houses. I'm never too surprised to see a dark shape moving along the path below. If it's a very small one, I know it's a hedgehog. They are established here around the gardens. Discreet foragers that they are, they only come out at night. Once when I was walking along the path below, I stopped and stood still, and a hedgehog came up to me and perched on me shoe. He looked up at me with small beady eyes full of curiosity. I expected that once he realised he had blundered into one of them gigantic creatures called humans, he would roll up in a ball and show his bristling spikes. But no, he looked steadily at me, and I returned his curious gaze. After a minute or so, he turned and waddled away into the undergrowth, leaving me to resume me late-night saunter. Now, when it's late at night, you don't hear a sound, for there is no traffic on the Breitenbachstrasse across the wall, the noise barrier that was built there to spare the townhouse complex. The only thing you do hear on summer nights is the sound of bleating and tinny bells. The wife had explained to me that the tract of grass on the far side of the Breitenbachstrasse is used by some local farmer to graze his flock of sheep. They're always out there grazing at night, and any chance activity at that hour will set them bleating. Now, looking down from the window, I'm also likely to see Théo, the Hofer's cat, either emerging from a cat hole at the side of their house or else going back in. Théo is getting on in years, and he's not keen on defending his territory from other cats, usually choosing the better part of valour if an interloper crosses his path. Accordingly, he only comes out for a foray late at night. Still, I'd say not much escapes his notice. He often comes to our patio, especially if the glass door into the house is ajar, and meows, demanding to be let in. But the wife always shoos him away, because, as she explained to me, he wants to go on a tour of inspection all through the house, and she's allergic to the hairs he leaves behind. As it is, He insists on sleeping on one of the patio chairs and meows indignantly when she shoos him off. Everyone calls him Monsieur Théo because he's a French cat. There was a mystery around his origin, as I recall, for he just appeared as a stray and was taken in by the Hofers. It soon emerged that he never responded to calls, commands or conversation unless it was in French. If he appears and you say to him, "Ça va, mon brave Théo?" the reply is a meow. If you address him in German, he ignores you. All the families in the complex have lived there for quite a few years, and they know each other quite well. The only problem is the 8th house at the back wall overlooking the Breitenbachstrasse. This has changed hands a number of times. At the time I'm speaking of, it had been vacant for upwards of a year. One evening, while we were having tea out on the patio, the wife told me excitedly that the 8th house was sold at last. But not to live in, she added. There was a health insurance company with offices down the road. They were running out of space, they said, so they bought this house as a temporary measure. They were going to put their IT department there. They waived their right to come to monthly meetings of the householders. Whatever people wanted to do for the common good would have their automatic agreement, they said. So, one day not long after that, a van arrived and unloaded all sorts of computer equipment and office furniture, and they moved in. The personnel varied, but the constant element consisted of 3 or 4 men in their 30s or 40s. They came on their bicycles each morning. At noon, they issued forth on foot, and shortly afterwards returned with sandwiches or pizza from the local supermarket bakery. When evening came, they left, though sometimes one or another might be seen coming or going at night. Once they were moved in and their equipment was all set up, they turned out to be very quiet. The Feutzes, who were now their next-door neighbours, were not bothered by any noise during the day. Everyone got used to them, though no one actually knew them. They were working for this health insurance company, that was all we knew. Now, in Switzerland, you have to have health insurance, but you get it not from the government, but from private sector companies, and there are quite a few of these, so the choice is wide. The thing was, nobody we knew was insured with this particular company. But obviously they were in day-to-day business. One night when I found it hard to sleep up in my bedroom in the attic, I got up out of bed and went to the side window. Below me was the sleeping complex. I could see the neighbours' houses, all in darkness. I could see across to the 8th house, and it was in darkness too. I looked down at the path below, and sure enough, there was me hedgehog friend, waddling along in the pale light of the lamps. Then suddenly, my attention was drawn back to the 8th house, for it seemed to me that I'd seen a flicker of light there. I looked, and it was so. In fact, there was a regular pulse of light every half-minute about. The flash of light lasted only a moment each time, but it could be seen lighting up the rooms in the interior and flashing out through the skylight on the roof. Fascinated, I watched this for a long time. I wondered what it could be. Obviously machinery, computer equipment. But I had no reason to believe that anyone was there operating this equipment. I looked at my watch. It was 1:30 in the morning. No, a work shift was hardly likely at such an hour. They must have left the computers going, I reasoned, or maybe a printer churning out pages and pages of data for a report. After a while I got tired of watching this unchanging light pattern and went back to bed. In the morning I mentioned it to the wife over breakfast. No, the men could not have been there, she said. The printers must have been left on to do a big print run overnight. I couldn't disagree with this interpretation, so I said no more. Just whenever I woke up at night and went to the window to look out on the summery darkness, I would often see that steady pulse of light emanating from the far house. I didn't mention it to the wife. It didn't seem worth pursuing. One night in August, however, when I was there, I got up out of bed feeling restless, maybe because the moon had been shining brightly on me as I slept. I went to the window, opened it, and looked out. I felt groggy, as I always do when I wake up directly out of some dream. I stopped in amazement, for the lights were working in the far house, but not in the way I'd seen before. This time, there was a steady stream of light shining through the skylight and up into the night sky. I heard a low, indistinct hum all around. Was it coming from the sky above the house, or from the house itself? I groped to find me watch. It said 3:30 or thereabouts. What was going on over there? Didn't anybody but me notice? As if in answer to me question, I saw a dark shape trotting across the path between the houses. It was Monsieur Théo. He must have been watching the whole thing. Then he turned aside and crossed the flower beds, and I saw his dark shape disappearing into the cat hole in the wall of Hofer's house. I turned and went back to bed. When I woke up in the morning, I wondered if I had dreamed the whole thing. Still, I did tell the wife over breakfast. It was just their equipment running at night, she told me. Nothing suspicious. The Foytses next door to them are very pleased to have them as neighbours, because they never hear them, and they are never even there at night. She looked at me sceptically. Maybe you did dream it. We had been sitting outside on the patio having breakfast, for it was a warm summer's day. After the wife went inside, I stayed to finish my coffee, and Monsieur Théo appeared. He looked at me. I looked at him. I could tell that we shared a secret. I wanted to let him know of my suspicions about the house across the way. So I told him, Il y a quelque chose qui ne tourne pas rond là-bas. Having thus expressed his agreement, he went back to Hofer's garden. I stayed in Laufen for 2 weeks and remained curious as to developments in the house across the way. As it happened, I didn't have long to wait. Another night, I awoke at a late hour and went to the window. I looked at my watch. It was again between 3 and 3:30. I looked out, and there was the intense beam of light streaming through the skylight of the far house. But something told me to look skyward, and at the other end of the beam was a dark looming shape, very large, an aircraft of an unknown sort, hovering at around 300 feet off the ground. It was a great dark shape, as I say, but the beam from the skylight seemed to pick up some gleaming metal ridges on it. The craft made hardly any sound of engines or anything like that. Just a low hum was audible. I couldn't be sure if it came from the hovering craft or the house below. After a while, the shape seemed to lift into the night sky, and at the same time, the shaft of white light from the house faded and was gone. There was only an odd flashing light from within the house. But all was not over. The front door of the house opened, and I could see light inside. A man stood framed in the doorway. He was waiting for something. After a moment, I heard a sound, a familiar one. It was the bleating of sheep and their tinny bells. Soon I saw the back gate to the complex opening in the high wall built to protect the complex from traffic noise. and 3 men came in. They walked the short distance to the 8th house and stood before the entrance. There was a muted exchange of formalities with the man at the open door. Then they went in. The door closed behind them, and I saw no more. But I looked down at the path between the houses, and there was Monsieur Théo, standing silently and taking it all in. This had been no dream. I was awake, and I had seen the beam communicating with the craft, after which it had let off 3 night visitors. Perhaps they had abseiled, and the 3 had then been admitted to the house. So there was activity in that house in the middle of the night. They just kept very quiet about it. But Monsieur Théo was watching, and I was watching, and we both knew. I slept late the following morning. I didn't tell the wife what I had seen, for I was sure she'd say I was dreaming, or might even think I'd gone crazy. The next night, I went to bed late, and lay down on the bed in me clothes. I was determined to keep vigil this night, and see what the next episode would be. As I expected, there was nothing untoward at first. The firehouse looked occupied, and there were figures moving about in the rooms on the ground floor, but they were keeping very quiet. At last, about 2:30 in the morning, a light beam began to be emitted through the roof, just like the night before. The pencil of light ranged up in the cloudy night sky. And then, about 3 o'clock, I heard a low but powerful hum. And the craft I had seen returned to hover near the house. After a while, it seemed to descend into the corner of the field with the sheep across the Breitenbachstrasse. I heard some frantic bleating and bells ringing, but it was hard to hear over the hum. Soon the front door of the farmhouse opened, and 3 men filed silently out. They were carrying rucksacks. After a pause, another man came to the door, shut it behind him, and followed the 3. By this stage I could no longer contain my excitement, so I crept down the stairs, being careful not to rouse the wife, whom I could hear peacefully snoring, and went out of the house through the patio doors at the back. All was balmy and quiet in the late summer's night. I crept down the garden path and out onto the main path between the houses. Sneaking around the corner onto the plaza area, I spied a familiar figure. "Monsieur Théo," I whispered, "t'as-tu vu?" There was a hum and a whoosh now as the dark craft rose into the air. Monsieur Théo and myself instinctively retreated into the shadow of the wall of Hofer's garden. We didn't have long to wait. We heard the back gate of the complex opening and closing, and one man came up the path to the 8th house. "Les 3 gars sont partis," I commented to Monsieur Théo in a whisper. "Lui reste." The man was turning the key in the lock to open the door when he heard Monsieur Théo's voice out of the darkness. He whirled around with a start and saw us. "We saw the whole thing," I called to him as he turned rapidly away. "We know what you're up to. You can't hide." The man walked rapidly into the house with what looked like a despairing gesture and closed the door behind him. I looked at Monsieur Théo and he looked at me. "Je t'avais dit que quelque chose ne tourne par rond là-bas," I whispered to him. With a frightened meow, he turned tail and headed back to his cat hole. Enough excitement for one night. I felt much the same. I went home and crept up to bed. The next morning I awoke with a resolve. I would have to tell the wife. It was her house after all, and she needed to know. We sat out at the table on the patio having breakfast. "Listen," says I at last, putting down my coffee cup. "There's something you need to know. About the house. About this complex. About that house over there, I said darkly, pointing to it. Well, she said, her coffee cup at her lips. The people in that house are not what they seem. In fact, they don't seem to be human at all. They're aliens, that's what I think. Aliens? Yes, extraterrestrials of some kind. They're on a mission here, I tell you. Or else they may be secret agents of the federal government, going about some conspiracy against our liberty, unbeknownst to law-abiding citizens. The whole thing about health insurance and computers is just a front. Have you taken leave of your senses? She asked. Should I call the doctor? Forget it, I told her grimly. For the past few nights while you were asleep, snoring, in your room at the front of the house, I have been observing that house over there through the side window. You know what they're doing at night with all them flashing lights I told you about? They're sending homing signals to some kind of aircraft that comes by at 3 a.m. There's a beam of light through the roof that guides them in. The ship lands in the field where the sheep are, the ones I used to hear bleating. They make a hell of a racket when them aliens land, I may tell you. All right, she said, thinking it best to humour me. Look it, I said. They dropped off some kind of a delegation of 3 men, who then stayed at the house, holding meetings or data gathering or data input, I don't know. Last night, the mothership came back and they boarded and flew off into space. One of the so-called computer engineers came back to the house. I was there with Monsieur Théo. We confronted him. You and the cat? Good God, what did the man say? Not much. He knew the jig was up. He just went into the house. Ha! I exclaimed. Talking to devil. Our patio overlooks one of the paths through the complex, the one leading from the Brieslachstrasse at the front to the door of that house. The wife always likes to sit there because she can see everyone who passes to and fro and knows what the neighbours are up to. Just now, who should come striding along the path but the computer engineer carrying his briefcase. Seeing us through the hedge, he began to raise his hand in a habitual gesture of greeting, but then thought better of it and let the hand drop hopelessly to his side. He stopped. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he walked up the steps into the garden and came across to where we were sitting. I am sorry about last night, he began hesitantly. And the night before, I added. I really owe you an explanation, he said helplessly. Well, it had better be a good one, I said, and none of this nonsense about health insurance or IT. He laughed embarrassedly. All right, he said. I motioned to a vacant chair at the breakfast table. Coffee? I asked. Thank you, he said. As I poured him a cup, he looked from one to the other of us, slowly, thoughtfully, weighing his words in advance. This is not part of the plan, he said. No one here was supposed to know anything about us or our mission. But you have seen things you are not supposed to see, and also you are both old. You will not live to see the worst. So I think it is no harm to tell you, if you keep it to yourselves. The wife and I both nodded, though we didn't know what he meant by the worst. We felt sure it would all be explained to us in due course. And so it was. You see, he began, there is no such health insurance company as the one we say we work for. I suppose you could say we are computer engineers, though. But we are here on a mission. It is called the Alpine Glacier Survey. Taking another sip of his coffee, he went on speaking in a strange, stilted kind of German that told you he wasn't Swiss. The survey is a scientific project to measure the shrinking of the glaciers in the high Alps over a period of years. Our ships crisscross the Alps at night, cruising at a low altitude to take readings from the ground. and sometimes landing to put out surveyors who walk on the glaciers and take samples. With the melting of the glaciers now, we often find mummified bodies that have become exposed to the air. These are humans, often hunters or shepherds, who were out looking for their sheep, who strayed onto the glacier and fell into a crevasse or were buried by an avalanche. They never made it home, and people never found them. We see bodies that are as old as prehistory, and bodies that are as recent as 40 years ago, all frozen in time. We collect these bodies and bring them back to base for study by our scientists. We now know a great deal more about the human makeup than we did before. They do that at night, the wife broke in. But don't they get picked up by the Swiss Air Force? He chuckled. It is a well-known fact that the Swiss Air Force only works until 5 o'clock in the evening, he said. Besides, our radar blockers are pretty good. Do you go on these survey trips over the Alps? Asked the wife. No, he said. We are just ground staff. Our job is to download project data from the ships after each run across a section of the mountains. There are a number of such ground stations around the perimeter of the Alps. So that's why the ships come hovering around here at 3 a.m, I said, when you send up a beam of light. That's right, he said. Each ship working the Western Alps comes back here after its run. The beams guide it in. It does not need to land. It just sends the new data set down the light beam and we process it next day. But sometimes a ship does land, I said, in the field over there. I saw it happen these past few nights. He nodded. That was to land 3 of our operatives. I saw them go in and then leave the following night. A conference or an inspection, I suppose? He smiled and shook his head. Not quite, he said. The 3 who arrived were new staff to man the ground station here. The 3 who left were the old staff you have been seeing for a while. They are now on the way home after their Earth posting. Where is this home? Asked the wife suddenly. Where have you come from? From a world so far away you have no name for it, he replied, for you do not know of its existence. Even your telescopes cruising in outer space are far from detecting it. And why have you come here? We are old hands at space exploration, he said. We have been at this game for much longer than you have, and our reach is quite vast. We have come to specialize in recycling burnt-out planets that used to support life. Is that what brings you here, then? She asked. Is our world such a world? Of course, he nodded. That is the reason for our mission. We have been observing Earth for a long time, and we came to realize it is doomed. Doomed? Asked the wife. How can you be sure? The governments of Earth are still only interested in aggrandizing themselves at each other's expense. They will never agree on the measures needed to save this planet. Businesses go on making profits from exploiting the Earth in unhealthy ways. Even the ordinary citizens in all countries are only concerned with their own lives and their prosperity or their short-term survival, depending on where they live. No one really does anything. Soon it will be too late. Very soon. The Earth will get hotter, most of the world will become uninhabitable, or else submerged by rising oceans. Even the Alps that you love so well will become a dry desert of rock. Man will have nowhere to go. He will become extinct, and so will the animals with him. He looked at us from one to the other. I am sorry. I assume you can bear to hear this, because you will not live to see it. You are both old, both of you, and so you will be spared from seeing the worst. And you? Why do you care? Asked the wife. Assuming you are right, what will you do when all this happens? Our plan is to colonize the Earth and recycle the planet's system so that it can bring forth new life. We will send a population here from our world to settle the Earth. I should add that all the major data gathering projects, like the Alpine Glacier Survey, are to give us a complete knowledge of life on Earth as it is, and the makeup of the Earth, before its dissolution. The wife and myself are both silent now. So, he said, rising from the table, you see, I have kept my promise. Will you keep yours? We looked at each other and nodded. The computer engineer walked down the garden path and soon disappeared into the far house. That evening we sat out on the patio after dinner, drinking a pot of tea. But it was late August, and it soon darkened and grew cooler, and the wife went inside to get something warmer to wear. I stayed, deep in thought. When it was just about dark, and the lights came on around the housing complex, I saw a familiar shape coming up the garden path. It was Monsieur Théo on one of his tours of inspection. Not finding admittance through the patio door, he sat down at my feet, purring audibly. Looking at him now in the fading light, I realised how old he was getting. He just wasn't fast enough for the neighbourhood cats, who were all younger. He stared out into the gathering gloom. I followed his gaze. He was looking at the 8th house, now dark and seemingly empty. Je t'avais bien dit, I said to Monsieur Théo. Il y avait quelque chose qui ne tournait pas rond là-bas, was all he said. You have been listening to The Alien Townhouse by Turlough Conmee from More Tales Told by a Dubliner. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already. So, until next time.